In the earlier lecture on this particular theme, we talked about the kind of changes which came in the various economies of the world. Especially we talked about Britain, that how Britain, which was at a very preeminent position, and the kind of changes which came in the British economy during this time. And we talked about that how there was some kind of a boom in British economy after the war, and how this boom converted into some sort of a slump as well. And from 1920s onwards especially, we find that this kind of a slump continued in Britain. And when we had the Great Depression in 1929, we find that how the British economy and rest of the economies of the world as well, they also suffered. And one of the reasons which was being attributed to this kind of a situation was the context of the returning to the gold standard, which has been cited by some of the economists of that particular period, especially Keynes talked about this kind of a situation. And we also see that there was a change in the balance of power during this particular period, where we find that USA was now comparatively a dominant economy, and not only economically but also from the political point of view, and the kind of changes which came in the British economy, where we find that not only agriculture but trade as well, both of them they suffered. And a number of conferences they were also being conducted during this time, whether in Brussels in 1920 or Genoa in 1922. And we find that some kind of recommendations they were being made for the removal of these obstacles which were coming to the economy during this time. But we do not find that much change came during this particular period. And when you talk about the pre-war international economy, especially, one of the major aspects in terms of its hold on the minds of the policymakers, and this came out in a way undented, and that was the gold standard. And this is also being cited as one of the reasons where we find that the colonial or the British economy especially was in a way hurt because of this particular reverting to the gold standard. And we find, when you talk about the idea of gold standard, then the Genoa Conference of 1922 reaffirmed its faith in the gold standard as well. And when you talk about the various committees, Cunliffe Committee for example appointed in Britain to consider its post-war monetary problems, and it assumed that the gold standard would continue. And the commitment to the gold standard was strong in the USA as well, and it was embodied in the form of Benjamin Strong, who was the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank. So we find that not only in Britain but as well as in USA, this kind of a commitment to the gold standard was there. And we find that they were adherents of this gold standard, especially we talked about Benjamin Strong, who was the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank. And we also see that how after the First World War, we see that how America emerged as the strongest economy, and it also made some kind of adherence to the gold standard and some kind of conditions for continuing to finance the European reconstruction could also be seen in America, where a number of plans to support the European economies they were being brought about. So we find that the pre-war manager of the gold standard Britain and the post-war leader amongst the industrial nations like USA, they were both, they had their belief in the old-fashioned religion, in that sense, as Thomas Lemont had described the gold standard. So both of them, they had this kind of a belief in the gold standard, and they felt that it was one of the imperatives in terms of the economic measures. And we find that when you adhere to this kind of a system in the changed conditions of the post-war era, it in a way created conditions for the Great Depression of the 1920s. And when you talk about the system of the gold standard, what it meant for the international economy, then we have to understand this kind of a system, that how the system, whether it was useful or it was not useful at that point of time for the international economy of that particular period, because both Britain as well as USA, they were adhering, or they had this kind of a firm belief in the gold standard. So, it was an important concern of the economy of that particular period, and we find that when you talk about the gold standard, how it has to be seen, what are the features of it, then the free flow of gold between individuals and the countries has to be there, and the maintenance of the fixed values of the national currencies in terms of gold and hence each other, and thirdly the absence of an international coordinating organization. So, we find that these were the defining features of the gold standard, that how it can have some kind of a free flow, and we also see that it need not be in a way coordinated by any international body as well. And when you see this kind of a situation, when you talk about these characteristics, that how the countries which were facing problems of the balance of payment deficits, they would experience outflow of gold to the countries which are enjoying the balance of payment surplus. So, this is how this would work as well. But to understand the situation, we also have to see that to maintain the fixed value of currency, which comes under pressure when gold flows out, and the economies would have to undertake deflation, which is the forcing of the domestic prices to fall, so that the domestic price level can change suitably to maintain the exchange rate. So, we find that such kind of measures, they had to be undertaken, and when these measures they were being undertaken, then only the economy is going to be stable in that sense. And we find that during this particular period, such kind of measures which were being talked about, they were not conducive to the changes which were coming at that point of time. So, it was necessary that the reliance on the gold standard should have been less, it should not have been there, as has been talked about by the critics as well, especially Keynes and other scholars. They have talked about that it was some kind of folly to revert to the system of the gold standard, and it should not have been done. It was detrimental to the health of the British economy in that sense. And we find that when you talk about the kind of options which are there, the policy option of devaluation or the downward revision of the value of the one's currency vis-a-vis foreign currency was ruled out in the gold standard. So, in that sense, devaluation will not take place, and it would also in a way impact the economy in an adverse manner in that sense. And when you talk about the kind of changes which came from 1925 to 1929, and how the domestic and the international policies of the major countries, they were aimed at maintaining the gold standard during this time, and how they were not effective also, these kinds of attempts which were being made, and it is some kind of a testimony to the altered conditions of the world economy, and not to a lack of sincerity on the part of the policy makers. So, we find that this kind of a changed scenario of the world economy during this time, and how many of the policies which were being made, they were not effective during this particular period. And we also talked about earlier the kind of boom and the slump which came in the British economy during this time, and how especially 1925 was a turning point in more than one way in the British economy. And when we try to understand it, how the wranglings and the recriminations about the treatment of Germany subsided with the Davos reparation plan and the Locarno Pact in 1925. So, how Germany was talking about the kind of a situation, the way it was being maltreated by the victorious powers, and we find that the kind of support which was being in a way given to Germany at this time by the other countries. And at the same time, we also realize that Germany also did not pay fully the reparation amount which was being demanded from it, and we see that this kind of a situation was also could be seen in Europe, where many countries were expecting Germany to pay the reparations and the war indemnity, but that was being not done by Germany completely. And we find that when you talk about the political stability during this particular period, which was also some sort of a fragile kind of a thing, was followed by a decision to return to the gold standard. And when you talk about the entire world, definitely this particular period, a lot of changes could be seen in the economic sphere, and how the production of the raw materials and the foodstuffs, they increased by 11%, trade by 19%, and the trade in manufacturers by 29%, and how America was leading the boom and lent to many other nations the kind of money which was being given by America, and $2,192 million net, and it was enjoying the returns as well. And two major nations which were left out of the golden 20s were Britain and Germany. So in that sense, we find that Britain especially suffered, especially after 1925, and Germany because of the participation in the war, and how it was a defeated country, because of which we realized that Germany had to suffer in terms of not only giving up its territories, and apart from that, the kind of money which it had to pay in terms of reparations was also one of the concerns. And the analysts and the experts, they have argued that this kind of a downturn in Britain was because of the gold standard, and the way it decided to go back to the gold at pre-war parity, and because of which we find that we have an overvalued pound, and this harmed the British economy in two ways, especially by making imports relatively cheaper, thus restricting the development of new industries, because when they were able to export in a cheaper products than the domestic industries, they did not have much to do, because of which we find that the new industries, they did not develop, and it also made the exports dearer in that sense. Now the exports became costlier in that sense, and we also see that the share of British exports in the international trade had been falling since before the war, but after 1929 it fell even in absolute volume as well. And we also see some of the specific reasons for the decline of particular export sectors. Coal production was hurt because of the mines being opened elsewhere, and the development of water power, and the cotton owing to the development of Indian domestic production and Japanese competition in the Far East. So we find that the specific regions of the world, and how these regions of the world, they were also operating, and because of their operations, we find that Britain also had some kind of a competition as well. And we find that the other industries of Britain, iron, steel, shipbuilding and metals, they were suffering from the wartime over expansion, that how they were expanded during the times of the war, and because of which we find that there was a fall in the exports and the rise in the unemployment as well. And we find that this unemployment was concentrated in the export industries, because the exports had fallen, and because of the fall in the exports, we find that they had to in a way remove the workers from their positions where they were working, because of which we find that there was a lot of unemployment. And despite the fact that authorities, they were concerned with the overvaluation of the pound, but the gold standard meant that they could only deflate and not devalue. That was one of the things, because of the gold standard, and because of which we find that the prices were sought to be reduced by reducing the money wages. And we also see, when you stick to the gold standard, it meant that the wages and through them prices had to be lowered as well. But when you see how it was operating in practice, this led to a major social upheaval in the form of a general strike from 4th to 13th May 1926. And so we find that how it created some kind of an unrest, and this strike was sparked off by the attempts to enforce the wage cuts in the most depressed industry, that was coal. And we find that the mine owners, they proposed a cut which was rejected by the unions, and because of which this kind of a situation arose, that how mines, they were locked out by the owners, who called on other workers to come out in solidarity. And we find that initially the response was very enthusiastic, but how the trade union later decided to call off the strike, the protest fizzled out with only miners they were holding out. And we see that this kind of a situation, the effect on the wages apart from the miners' wages was not notable. And when you see the price index, however, did fall from 160 in 1925 to 134 in 1929, and this fall can be principally attributed to the restrictive credit policy adopted by the government. So we find that the kind of changes which were coming in the economy, the kind of effect which was there on the wages, all of them was not in a way in the interest of the workers, and how which because of which we find that they went on a strike. And we see that that how pound was also overvalued, and the interest rates, they were kept high by the Bank of England to attract the short term capital and stabilize pound. But this had a depressing effect on the domestic economic activity, and if there will be some kind of depression in the domestic economic activity, then naturally the economy is not going to prosper as well. And we find that when you talk about the agricultural prices, they also fell during this time, and which was also as a result of the substantial increase in the production relative to consumption. And we find that how the kind of technological breakthroughs which had happened earlier, and because of the technological breakthroughs we find that the production had increased, and we also find that the restoration of pre-war acreage levels in Europe had also taken place. And we find that when you see 1920s, it was some kind of a troubled period for Britain, and we find that the kind of symptoms, the kind of causes, they were known, but at the same time the remedy which was being provided was grossly wrong. And we also see that no efforts were being made to stimulate production for the home consumption during this particular period. So it was also some kind of a deterring factor for the growth of the industries. And we also see that the sticking to the gold standard and the way it was being maintained also, because of which we find that the domestic economy was compressed, and the overvalued pound it messed up the British exports as well. And so we find that the pride of the British pound sterling was to be maintained, and the kind of price which was being paid for this was very heavy, and the kind of situation which it created was grotesquely ironic in 1931, because it was seen to be some sort of a myopic vision, and when it was faced with increasing strain on the pound, Britain abandoned the gold standard. So we find that they also realized it, but at the same time the way fixed it, it was comparatively much later. By the time a lot of damage had already been done, and we find that the kind of complexity which it had created, the kind of economic strain which was being created after the depression could not be done away with, and but it in a way implicated the political and the economic leadership of Britain, even more for causing the avoidable distress and privation of the 1920s. So, how the international operation of the gold standard was taking place, and how the condition for the depression it was being created because of it. We also have to understand this situation in the context of that particular period. And when you see the policies of the major countries of that at that point of time, and how British economy plunged into some sort of a crisis following the return to gold, we also see that the other countries they continue to try and prop up the system, but this did not take place, and how we see that over a period of time all these economies, especially Britain and Germany, they had to suffer as well. And we also see that when you talk about USA, which was a major economy at this point of time, and how the US Federal Reserve undertook to lower the interest rates to encourage the capital flow out of the US and into Britain. And this was an attempt to stabilize the struggling pound. And when you see it or compare it with the French currency franc, which was undervalued, the French had declined to take on the full pains of the deflation required by return to the pre-war levels of the exchange rates, and it attracted most of the gold. And we find that how France and USA, both of them, they accumulated gold, and how, but they did not have to expend under the gold standard. And on the other hand, when you see Britain, how it depressed its economy because of the gold standard. So there was some kind of a symmetry in the working of the gold standard as a system, where we find that how economies they were accumulating gold, and because of this we find that whether they were at the spectrum of Britain or they were at the spectrum of America and France, both of them we find those were glued to the idea of gold standard. And but they were asymmetrical in the framework of their working as well. And we see that how USA and France held 60% of the monetary gold by the end of 1920s, which was a huge amount, which was a very excess in terms of the requirement which they had, and the way they were not expanding their economies sufficiently. And so we find that the monetary expansion should have been greater, and fiscal expansion was not even seriously contemplated this time. And if both of them they had expanded, and then the resultant higher incomes would have increased the imports probably more than proportionately. But in this way it did not happen, and this would have raised the import share, and gold would have flowed out, decreasing the supply of the reserves. So we find that how franc and the dollar both were undervalued, and when you see the revaluation, which was the opposite of revaluation, could have been undertaken. And but when you see the kind of system which they were following, the gold standard prevented such a move, and revaluation was not even in the policy option as well. And when you see that the kind of burden which fell, or burden of the adjustment, it fell entirely on the debtor countries in the context of the early 1930s. Burden was too strong, and it destroyed the gold standard. And we also see when you see the situation in 1928, the Federal Reserve followed a contradictory policy to combat the speculation in the New York Stock Exchange. And whether the countries like Germans, they were trying to in a way eliminate the speculation, but we find that all in all the Atlantic economy was in the grip of contradictory policies at that point of time. And when you see the reason for the revival of the gold standard and the kind of attempts which were being made to sustain it in the condition, in that particular condition, they no longer were suitable for it. And policy making, when we tend to understand everywhere, was such as to depress the economic activity. And we find that all this kind of situation in Europe especially at that point of time was leading to a situation of the Great Depression, which finally broke in 1929. It finally happened in New York Stock Exchange, and where we find that the stock markets, they crashed in September 1929. And because of the economic depression, again we see that the various countries of the world, they had to suffer a lot. And so when we tend to see the various economies of the world, especially we talked about Britain, we talked about France as well, we talked about USA, we also talked about Germany, and how they were trying to cope up with the situation of the 1920s, especially after the First World War, the kind of efforts which were being made by them at different levels, but the kind of wrong policies which were being followed by them, especially we find as scholars they have talked about the gold standard, and how the gold standard was one of the reasons for this kind of a failure of the European, especially British economy, which had reverted to the gold standard. And we also talked about how USA also had faith in the gold standard, and USA was an economy, especially after 1920, after the First World War, we find that USA had become a dominant economy, and not only in the economic sense but also from the political point of view. So in these were some of the important aspects of the economy during the interwar period, during the First and the Second World War. And the issue of the economic depression will be taken up in the next lecture. Thank you very much.